Welcome. I'm Abe Newman, and I'm a professor at Georgetown. I'll be chairing this panel. We are going to have, I think, an incredibly urgent discussion about democracy in a post-truth world. We have an excellent panel with most of them here. So we will start with those that are here. To my left, I have Henry Farrell from George Washington University, Melissa Schwartzberg from NYU, and Scott Page from the University of Michigan, Jacob Hacker, I'm going to imagine is going to be here soon, from Yale. I just wanted to start the conversation by thinking about, when I think about this topic of democracy in a post-truth world, I think about these kind of two fundamental issues for democracy, which is contestation and participation, and how when we move on both of those dimensions into a greater and greater kind of conflict over what is truth and what's the point of narratives that are being told. And so if you move away from, let's say, the traditional view of a marketplace of ideas where people are kind of putting out their ideas and then there's going to be something that rises to the top, to a place where you're trying to actually just create competitive narratives that are not really aspiring to kind of something rise to the top, but you want to just undermine your, let's say, political competitor. But maybe where we're going now is a place where the ultimate goal of certain actors is just disorder. It's not really even just to create a competing narrative, but it's just to create the sense of chaos and what that does to societies that are trying to achieve collective action. And similarly, I think on the dimension of participation, you're seeing increasingly that participation is not just local, it's not just national, but it's also transnational, where actors outside of the democracy itself are participating in the democracy. And if you combine those two dimensions of contestation and participation, and you're thinking of the move from, let's say, the marketplace of ideas to chaos, and you're thinking of the actors as moving from the demos to the world polity, how difficult that is to have any kind of consensus making or policy making. So I'm hoping that in the next several hours, these, amongst many other topics, can be covered. We're going to turn to the panel, and each person will speak for 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have an opening conversation to the audience. So I thank you for coming, and I will turn it over first to Henry, and then I'll move down the group.
So I should first of all, before I begin, say that I was drafted myself in as program chair as an entirely inadequate substitute for Danielle Allen, who is going to be talking, she's going to be giving the plenary address in this room right after this session. And I urge you all to stay on for that, because it is going to be extraordinary. And it also is, I think, going to reflect in some very profound ways on some of the themes that we are all trying to grapple with in this panel and elsewhere. So, in order to understand what's happening with democracy in a post-truth era, I think we need to develop far, far better accounts and understandings than we currently have of what democracy's actual relationship to the truth is. And here in particular, I think that we need to develop some kind of an informational account of democracy. In other words, we need to understand far better than we do at the moment what kinds of informational processes democracy involves, what kinds of levels of accurate factual information it requires to function well, and what levels of agreement on factual information it requires to function properly. So these are things that we simply do not have at the moment. We don't have that kind of theory. None of us, I think, have thought in that way in a very systematic fashion. And what theoretical accounts we have are, by and large, they're not entirely fitted for purpose. So here, for example, one could think about the work of people like Charles Lindblom, which I think deserves a revival. It's quite extraordinary, his work, for example, on the intelligence of democracy. There are other people who have bits and pieces, but all of these people were writing in different eras for different purposes, and their work isn't quite fitted for the urgent needs that we have right at the moment to understand what is the relationship between democracy and information. So what I'd like to do is to throw out the beginnings of a simple account of how democracy and information work and when they work well. And I should acknowledge that in so doing, I am stealing deliberately and blatantly from a large number of other people, including indeed a couple of the panelists here, and also from people who I am working with or who I have been influenced by, including Bruce Schneier, Cosma Shalitzi, and also Jack Knight and Jim Johnson's book on the priority of democracy. And here, one of the fundamental problems that any political system faces, one of the fundamental questions that any political system faces, is that any system faces a population of people who have heterogeneous, very different perspectives, very different interests, and very different goals. And any political system faces the problem of trying to reconcile these goals, these perspectives, these beliefs, and trying to make sure that these different beliefs coexist in some way that is reasonably stable. And of course, this presents enormous challenges. When it doesn't work, when people with different perspectives, different beliefs, different commitments disagree with each other strongly, you can see an enormous degree of unrest, you can see stasis, and in worst case scenarios, you can see actual civil war and similar breakout. So this, I think, is a reasonably well understood problem in our understanding of how political systems work and what challenges they face in their need to ensure stability. But what we often forget, and what I think is important to understanding how democracy works when it works well, is that there's an obverse to that coin too, which is that there is an extraordinary degree of benefit and value to be extracted precisely from that diversity. And here, and this is something that Scott's work has dwelt upon in great detail, if you think about how to solve problems, how to deal with enormous, complex, and difficult issues of the sort that challenge any society, the more perspectives that you have within that society that you are readily able to draw upon, the better likely you are going to be able to find good or better solutions to those problems that you would be able to find otherwise. And here, to use an analogy from mathematical evolutionary biology, just as, from the perspective of biologists, the information that you find within a species is more or less contained in the genetic diversity of that species. Similarly, the amount of information that is contained within a population is more or less it's a product of the useful disagreement, the useful diversity of perspectives that you find in that population. And this, I think, helps us to think about how democracy works when it works well and what the conditions are for it working well. Because it suggests, first of all, a basic warrant, one basic justification for democracy, which is that plausibly of the various systems that we have discovered for rule, it is going to be the one which, by allowing people to express and to battle over their different perspectives and beliefs, it is the one that is best suited to extracting the relevant information from this diversity and transforming that information potentially into ways of solving problems. Obviously, that turns out to be far more difficult and messy in real life than it is in the abstract. Equally, this does not necessarily mean that the democratic institutions we have are by any means the best possible such institutions for solving problems. And finally, as Melissa will discuss, this is far from the only plausible justification for democracy. Even if democracy didn't plausibly do well at this stuff, there are many, many other ethical justifications or other justifications which one could have for democracy. But what it does suggest is that democracy needs, if it is to work well, to maintain a somewhat delicate equilibrium. On the one hand, it needs to be able to extract as much useful information as it can from the divergences, the differences of perspective and belief within its population. But on the other hand, it has to make sure that these divergences and differences of belief do not overwhelm it, do not plunge it into profound disagreement, do not lead to genuine factual information being corrupted, all of these conditions which turn out to be quite difficult to resolve. Notably, these are not difficulties that autocratic systems face. Autocratic systems, by and large, look to suppress divergences of belief, divergences of opinion, in order to increase stability, which means that they face different trade-offs, but they do not have quite the same difficult task of maintaining this equilibrium between exploiting diversity and not being overwhelmed by it. So I think this helps us to understand why it is that we are in the very, very problematic situation that we are in today, which is that we more or less, we see ourselves in the United States, and here I'm talking specifically about the United States, we see ourselves in a country where many of the divergences of perspectives and beliefs from inside the system have metastasized in a certain sense, and in particular have metastasized on the right. And this is not, in spite of the fact that it has become more apparent in the last couple of years, this is not something which is a recent process. You can trace this back. If you look, for example, at Nicole Hemmer's historical work on the ways in which the right since the 1960s, or some elements in the right, have sought specifically to weaponize their criticisms of what they perceive as being a liberal consensus of accepted facts that they believe is weighted against them. If you look at the development of Fox News, at the development of other institutions such as Breitbart Media, which have more or less sort of taken the Fox approach and radicalized it, and also finally, if you look at the ways in which the operations of social media firms have more or less inadvertently managed to heighten these potential divergences and differences through algorithms which are designed more or less to maximize, unquote, engagement, unquote, which means in effect that that YouTube and other such social media tend to serve people. They tend to serve people political content, which is exciting, which is which stirs up emotions, which gets people angry or fearful or whatever, because this is what engages people, rather than material which is more boring, but which is perhaps more conducive to a better understanding of the factual content of reality. Between all of these, we see how it is that that differences of perspective within a population can be weaponized by actors within that population, and can present some serious problems to democracy. This also is, to a greater or lesser extent, and I think this is the topic of a reasonable disagreement since the research isn't in yet, this also to some extent has been accentuated by interventions from abroad. Here we see that that effectively we see that authoritarian regimes such as China and Russia, as Molly Roberts and others have described them, have effectively figured out that censorship is not the only way to preserve stability, that if, for example, they are trying to prevent people from organizing against them, one very good way to do this is to destabilize and delegitimate the kinds of knowledge that they need to coordinate against the regime by injecting in as much nonsense, as much distraction, as much potentially divisive content as possible to make it nearly impossible to organize. And this provides greater stability in authoritarian regimes, and plausibly, when it is applied to democratic regimes, it provides, as we have discovered in the last couple of years, a potential weapon of destabilization against them, because it corrupts and degrades the kinds of common knowledge which we need in order for the divergences of democracy to be contained and channeled in useful ways. The standard defense of First Amendment critics of speech is that the best antidote to bad speech is more speech. And what we have seen is that Putin and other people have discovered that the best antidote to more speech is bad speech, and that this turns out to be an extraordinarily effective means of disruption, especially in a society like the United States, where I think most of the work has been done already by forces internal to US politics. So this, I think, helps us to think about ways in which the current problem has come into being, and it helps us perhaps to provide a better and more specific analysis of precisely why it is difficult for democratic regimes to maintain their stability in a world in which people are incapable of agreeing on the truth, and why it is that democratic regimes are more likely to be overwhelmed by these kinds of problems than are autocratic regimes, which are subject to different potential threats to their stability. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Henry, for the invitation, and thank you for your wonderful work as co-program head. So I'd like to focus today on this supposed crisis of post-truth democracy. There's a standard lament, and that is it goes something along these lines. We have entered a period in which we cannot agree on even the basic facts that would ground political decision-making. We would think that perhaps our citizens are more ignorant than ever before. That is, they don't just lack basic political knowledge, but perhaps encouraged by our president, they've embraced the trope of fake news so fully as to even undermine their own capacity for rational judgment, and that citizens today have been liberated to express their most racist, sexist, xenophobic sentiments. And of course, there's something right about this, that one couldn't deny that there seems to have been it would seem perhaps an uptick in some types of the liberation of political ignorance to both on the moral and the political dimension. People feel freer perhaps to express these views that seem to be misleading or wrong openly. But what I'd like to point out today is not how do we live with deplorables, so to speak, but can our democracy, in fact, survive the view that the judgments of our citizens are hopelessly corrupt? How do we live with the problem of the duped and the damned? And again, it's not that people are, in fact, either duped or damned, but what does it mean to live in a community in which citizens regard each other as being such? So my claim today is that this experience of Trump and elsewhere in the world, something like Brexit, for instance, has led many citizens to view each other as duped or damned. And by duped, I mean incapable of even identifying their own interest. I'm sorry. Of even identifying their own interest. One obvious claim is that voters are so ignorant that they don't see that the economic policies defended by conservatives will ultimately harm them. And by damned, I mean that they're morally corrupt, that they're motivated by racism, xenophobia, sexism, that they're incapable of recognizing or acting for the sake of the interests of others. So again, the problem of the duped and the damned is not that citizens are ignorant or unjust, it's the lack of confidence and trust in each other's basic capacity for judgment. But what's important is that, at least in the United States, this view predates the 2016 election and is especially pronounced, again, prior to 2016 among Democrats. So right now I want to show you a little bit of suggestive evidence along those lines. So there's this April 2018 Pew Research study in which it becomes clear that Democrats' negative opinions have not changed meaningfully since the 2016 election, although Republican opinions have improved somewhat. So, just to see, there are some trends indicating that there's been this declining confidence in political wisdom overall since 1997. But the low point is in March 2016, prior to the election. This Pew study observes that Republicans and Republican leaners have driven this shift in overall views. That 33% of Democrats in March 2016, just after Super Tuesday, expressed confidence in the public's political wisdom. 32% do so in April 2018, so not a substantial shift. So we might wonder whether, in fact, the age of Trump has, in fact, ushered in new failures of confidence in our fellow citizens, or whether, especially on the left, we've been tempted by this view that, we face this problem of the ignorant rabble for quite some time. And in fact, this is, of course, this talking point about the liberal elite, that the liberal elite have long disdained the idea that the people have any sort of wisdom or that people are actually capable of making wise decisions. So here we are with this problem of the duped and the damned. Okay. Again, the worry is not voter ignorance as such. The question is whether or not is what it means to have this. So how would we characterize this problem of the duped? Well, it's essentially what's the matter with Kansas. People are basically ignorant or subject to manipulation. So this idea that the working class whites are voting against their economic interests. Another version of this, of course, is this Aiken-Bartels argument about the basic failures of instrumental rationality on the part of ordinary citizens, the language of blind retrospection, the tendency of voters to punish governments for random events like shark attacks. This preoccupation with Trump gaslighting citizens, this is the subject of a very interesting paper that will be presented tomorrow by Eric Bierbaum and Ryan Davis. But this is the idea that voters are being encouraged to believe that their sense is that what they're perceiving is misleading. So the basic worry is that citizens are incapable of even recognizing their own interest. And of course, the problem of the damned. So I have this quote from Rousseau: "It's impossible to live in peace with people one believes to be damned," and this is an issue of religious toleration, but we might think of it more generally. So there's the often cited remark by Hillary Clinton that half of Trump's voters constitute a basket of deplorables. Of course, there's the other part of that statement, which is less often noted, that that other basket of people, this is her language, who are people who feel that government has let them down. Nobody cares about them. Nobody worries about what happens to their lives and their futures, and they're just desperate for change. But this notion of the deplorables seemed to have rung true in a way to, I think, many people on the left, that these are people whose capacity for moral judgment is obviously corrupt by virtue of their racism, their sexism, their xenophobia. Now, the Rousseauian account would lead us to believe that the problem of the damned is that we believe certain citizens are incapable of seeing their fellow members as possessing interests worthy of care, or more importantly, of identifying and prioritizing perhaps a common good. So given the scale of contemporary pluralistic communities, we might think that we no longer need to worry about whether our fellow citizens can identify a common good. The notion even of a common interest could be discarded along with other abandoned political fictions. And of course, scholars of color, at least from the time of Frederick Douglass, have long suggested that this is the case, that American democracy in particular is so shot through with racism that it's basically impossible for people of color in particular to have any reasonable belief that white citizens care about their interests. Citizens of color have long confronted the problem of the damned, not the problem of the duped. Okay, so my basic claim is that these two beliefs about our fellow citizens, that they are on the one hand duped, incapable of recognizing their own interest, or they're damned, incapable of identifying and acting on behalf of the interests of others, constitute a threat to the authority of democratic outcomes on virtually any account one offers. So why would one agree to be bound by the outcome of decisions made by a group which includes either incompetent agents or which do not treat my interests as worthy of respect? So I think this is a different and in a way more fundamental problem than the standard issue in normative political theory, which is regarding how to remedy or cope with the fact of moral and political disagreement. Nonetheless, the problem of the damned, I think, raises a problem for political authority even on the most minimal aggregate of accounts. So why would I agree to remain part of and to be bound by the collective decisions of a group that includes a large number of members who do not regard my interests as worthy of equal respect and indeed who might seek to disenfranchise me? I think that the problem of the duped and the damned raises in a way boundary problems for democracy. And by that, I mean it's not so much how to constitute the demos outside of democracy, but what happens to democracy when the citizens themselves no longer believe themselves to be capable of rendering judgments. So I think this doesn't mean that we need to embrace any sort of epistemic or substantive account of democracy as a reliable means of yielding correct outcomes. I think even if we just understand just decisions in a purely procedural, aggregative fashion, this is still a problem for political authority. That is, even if we think democracy is just about the aggregation of individual interests, once we no longer have confidence in the capacity of individuals to judge these interests and to know where the shoe pinches, I think we no longer have grounds to believe these outcomes rightly bind us. And if we think that these interests, once aggregated, leave vulnerable minorities subject to abuse, it's very difficult to see how any sort of democratic decision-making could be justified. It would seem only the exorbitant cost of exit binds these members together as part of the same community. So, in sum, the problem of the duped and the damned creates this fundamental problem for the justification of political outcomes. So, are there remedies? Well, it would be ridiculous to say that there are easy remedies. But I do want to caution us about the ascription of ignorance or of moral blindness. That, in a way, is at least where the shoe pinches presumption constitutes a bedrock principle of democratic decision-making. So if the story is that people are, in a way, incapable of even identifying their own interests, it would seem to be impossible for us to justify democracy at all. So what would be a remedy? Well, we might think that there would be a remedy in terms of civic education. That would be, if we're concerned about political literacy, political knowledge, so to speak, civic education would seem to be available to us. But even if we thought that we might be able to fix the so-called problem of the duped that way, that we came to believe that our citizens were competent because they all received some sort of equal education, it's not clear to me that we would even be able to get anywhere near to solving the problem of the damned. That is, can civic education remedy the problem of racism, of our belief that people are, in a way, morally corrupt, in addition to, in some ways, actually being morally corrupt, especially in the context of a segregated residential system? Quite possibly not. However, from the standpoint of equality, one worry about the problem of voter incompetence, that is either the problem of the duped or the problem of the damned, is that it may keep us from necessary reforms. So here's one example. So at least since 2000, it seems that the one institution that most people could agree upon seeking to amend would be the Electoral College. The basic concern, one basic concern, is that it produces racial and ethnic disparities in voting power because of disparities across states. Famously, states such as Wyoming are substantially overrepresented relative to a system in which electoral votes were tied more closely to state populations. The 4 states with the largest Latino populations are all underrepresented. Yet the problem of the duped and the damned would incline us towards conservatism. That is, if we feared that any efforts at constitutional change would be captured by ignorant or malicious majorities, the prospective harms of tampering with existing structures would seem especially serious. So what can we do? In a way, we're going to be bound by this profound fear that our citizens are duped or damned and that we have no remedy to change it. So my suggestion, such as it is that we may need a form of exposure therapy to egalitarianism. And what would that mean? Well, the first step would be to expand eligibility and inclusion, which would be to instantiate reforms aiming at promoting inclusion and access to polls, early voting, and end to the automatic disenfranchisement of felons. This may seem willfully naive, of course, if we have the belief that there are some profound efforts at voter suppression. It seems strange that we would be willing not only to transcend those, but actually expand inclusion. So again, this is a remedy, almost not to be naive, but a very optimistic one. But if we were able to get through that would be a first step down the path of an effort at egalitarian reform designed to encourage ongoing engagement on questions of fundamental political life. So there's this risk that egalitarianism, that is in the form of increased majoritarianism, that this would usher in a period of policy instability, that majority rule would yield rapid cycling through winners and losers until the point at which some equilibrium might be reestablished. However, paradoxically, in the long run, it may be that only genuine egalitarianism, though accompanied by the instability produced by majority decision-making, can quell our anxieties, that only majority rule might be sufficient to secure the grounds on which citizens might be able to relate to each other as genuine equals and no longer confront the problem of the duped or the damned. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for arriving a little bit late. I believe that the only explanation for this can be that the Marriott front desk is trying to suppress the truth. And I want to also just thank not just the panelists, but also my co-author, Paul Pearson, for deciding not to come to APSA this year and handing responsibility for this panel over to me. The good news is that Paul and I have thought a lot about aspects of this question together, and so he is actually here in spirit speaking about it. Let me also just say that I think that my comments actually feed very nicely, even if they're going to seem a little different from the two prior sets of remarks. And in particular, I want to talk more about what Henry has discussed as the sort of elite story of arrival at this moment that well predates Trump's election. But I also want to talk about Melissa's point about how we view our fellow citizens, because in the kind of common narrative about Trump, I do think there's a tendency to think of this as emerging out of this volatile, xenophobic, as she put it, and fundamentally ignorant base of voters. You might call this the Borat view of Republican voters. If you remember Borat, there's a sort of priceless scene in which he gets up in front of this sort of rodeo audience and sings the Kazakh national anthem, which is quite funny, actually. It's not the actual Kazakh national anthem, but it is worth listening to if you haven't heard it before. But he also does a series of like call and response Q&As with the group, and everyone's cheering, and he says, we're gonna fight terrorism, and everyone says cheers, and then he goes on to more and more extreme and crazy things. At some point, the crowd stops cheering actually and starts looking at him funny, suggesting there are limits to the degree to which you can gin people up. But I actually think this sort of Borat view really needs to be countered with an understanding, if you will, of the top half of this picture, right? If this is the bottom-up story of the Republican base, we really need to think about the degree to which the elite story of movement toward a post-truth democracy, if that's what we'll call it, has really been driving a lot of the developments at the base. Now, there are two parts to the story, and it's worth giving another call out to Ed Lindblom, who recently passed away, because he paid a lot of attention to the power of business in American politics, and I think we should really remember that the corporate world is a huge part of the current Republican political coalition and a huge driver of a lot of the policies we see today. It's very hard to understand the plutocratic policy pushes on deregulation or on tax cuts without looking at the business community and the larger donor class, as it's often called. The other thing I would say is that the relationship between the Republican Party and the business community is a huge part of the story. And it's worth saying that in an earlier era, when the Republican Party was a much more moderate party, it had a very strong kind of moderating effect on the business community as well, because basically the party of the right with which it had to work was telling it that it had to come to the table and have debates about regulation, the welfare state, and so on. And Paul and I have written a whole book about sort of how this came unraveled, so I won't try to unpack the kind of causal story, but what I want to talk about is the ways in which both the retreat of the business community from that moderate stance and the shift of the Republican Party dramatically to the right has fed into this contemporary era of deceit. So with business, I think the way to understand this is really through the organizational representation of business. There's a tendency to focus a lot on are business leaders Democrats or Republicans, looking perhaps at their campaign donations. That is a huge mistake, because if you think about corporations and businesses as actors, and after all, Mitt Romney famously said, corporations are people too, my friend. If you think of them as actors, right, what's really important is not where they stand on a whole host of issues. It's where they stand on the few key issues where they exert their political influence. And here, I think the three organizations that really stand out as suggesting the transit of the business community are the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, and for want of a better term, the Koch network, which is basically the organization and network of donors that has been built by Charles and David Koch. Now, to do this in a thumbnail sketch, because I really want to get to the deceit side of the picture quickly, the Business Roundtable has gone from being this sort of high-minded group of CEOs that focus on pressing national problems, if from a conservative perspective, into basically a bunch of people who are wholly interested in the pay and prerogatives of CEOs. So that is not very useful when it comes to dealing with some of the larger problems of our society, indeed quite the opposite. The Chamber of Commerce has transited to a much more powerful organization that is essentially a lobbyist for hire for rent-seeking private corporations. It engages in a kind of lowest common denominator policy advocacy based on who's the biggest bidder. And in many cases, that means it is carrying water for the financial industry on finance and Wall Street issues, or for healthcare companies on health policy issues. And then finally, if you think about the Koch brothers, give them this. They are actually sincerely ideological. Unfortunately, the ideology that they espouse will essentially destroy the mixed economy that has brought us so much prosperity, health, and educational achievement. So these three organizations, or organizational nexuses are a very powerful conservatizing force on the GOP and particularly on policy. And a huge part of this, let's just be frank, is a long-standing tendency to lie. This may sound very ideological, but think about climate change denialism as sort of the principal example. The stakes really could not be higher. So once again, it's what you care about, the priorities. This is a very important issue to our society, to our world, to our planet, right? And for the most part, these groups have either been AWOL or on the wrong side of this issue. This is not a debate about the science or about the exact policy response. The stance of the big carbon emitters is one in which they wish to bury the truth that our planet is being destroyed by carbon emissions. Now, again, I want to be clear that this kind of denialism is not universal among the economic elite. Indeed, there are corporations on the other side, but they are not, let's be clear, spending the kind of time and capital that they do on other causes. Tim Cook, for example, seems to have invested himself much more fully in making sure that Apple can repatriate its profits than in the cause of ensuring that our planet is safe in the future. Now, the other side of this, and speaking of tax cuts, is what George H.W. Bush, one of the last of the Republican moderates, called voodoo economics when it was espoused by Ronald Reagan. And voodoo economics, of course, is the idea that cutting taxes increases revenue and supercharges the economy. This is a more contestable argument, but again, as I'll say in a moment, the ways in which this argument has been deployed are fundamentally deceitful and in ways that have added to this environment that we're talking about today. So why is it that we are tending to think so much about the base and not about the top? And I think a big part of it is that one of the primary consequences of plutocratic policymaking is actually populism, right? Is actually backlash. Now, there's the obvious way in which that's true in the sense that a lot of these policies have made the lives of less affluent Americans demonstrably worse, fueling backlash. But there's a less obvious way, because if you think about it, the Republican Party is very much like conservative parties were at the early part of the 20th century. As Daniel Ziblatt has written, these parties face this fundamental dilemma as lower-income voters entered the electorate. It's very similar, by the way, to the dilemma that the Republican Party faces as inequality grows, and in particular, as inequality grows and more of their support is coming from working-class white voters. It's that they want to hold on to the support of and provide benefits for those at the top, but they need the votes of those in the middle and bottom. And of course, this is where the what's the matter with Kansas arguments that Melissa alluded to come in. But really, that's asking the question from the wrong side, right? The question is, what's the matter with the Republican Party, right? Why did it choose to take the route that it did? Because let's be clear, right? There have been challenges as recently as 2000. A certain John McCain, right, tried to challenge the Republican Party orthodoxy. And revealingly, he's crushed in South Carolina by a populist, evangelically conservative-led hate and whisper campaign against him that uses the most base and deceitful and painful in many ways lies to bury his candidacy. Now, not to make McCain into a great hero of of liberalism. But just to make clear that this politics that plays out is very much driven by elite strategy. So George W. Bush was very different from his father, and he was certainly the choice of those in the conservative donor class who wanted big tax cuts. And they saw McCain as an existential threat. And when they told campaign consultants in South Carolina that they could read from the Lee Atwater script, they were unleashing this very dynamic that now gets so lamented as being a result of the Borat-like ignorance of mass voters. So in other words, as Ziblatt has written, conservatives have a choice of whether or not to open the Pandora's box of division, demonization, xenophobia, racism, violence, and much worse. And the Republicans opened the box. And Donald Trump may be the most unfortunate consequence of that. Let me end with, and by the way, to keep the McCain hagiography to somewhat of a minimum, let me just note that his choosing Sarah Palin as running mate was definitely more on the other side of the ledger. I will also note that Republicans did nothing to dissuade the birtherists, if we can call them that, the birthers who were essentially using a racist charge against President Barack Obama, and again, enabling Donald Trump's rise to power. So let me close by just talking about one example that I think really shows what's at stake in this discussion. The recent tax cuts were a big deal. They might even meet the standards of Joe Biden on the Affordable Care Act. They were a big fucking deal. And the reason they were is because they will throw our country into red ink while delivering huge benefits to the richest Americans in society. We liberals lamented, and I don't want to include you in that, I lamented, the Bush tax cuts of 2001 for delivering 40% of their benefits to the top 1%. Little did I know that Bush was an underachiever in plutocracy because the Trump tax cuts delivered 83% of their benefits to the top 1%. And to sell this, right, fundamental deception was used just as it was used in the attempt, narrowly defeated by John McCain, we're back to hagiography, to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. And moreover, Republicans have discovered very quickly that this is fundamentally unpopular with most of the people. They want to vote for them. And so what are they running on? They're running on immigration, more specifically lately, Molly Tibbetts, the deep state, and more of the rhetorical red meat that they think is the only way for them to hold on to power in 2016. Let me close with a story. It's a historical story that has contemporary resonance. When the, I think it was King Henry, decided that he would unify France, he had to convert to Roman Catholicism. Someone help me here with it. That's not
Henry of Navarre.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm the right first name. And he famously said, though I'm sure it's apocryphal, that Paris is worth a mass, right? It's worth it to do the Roman Catholicism thing if I get this great city. And I think the epitaph for Paul Ryan's political career, here is Paul Ryan, who came to Congress in 99. He came to Congress in 1999 as a young Ayn Rand acolyte, just after he once said that he had been dreaming of block grants for Medicaid since he was drinking out of kegs. So I guess just after he'd been drinking out of kegs and dreaming of block grants, he came to Congress and he finally achieved his lifelong dream of tax cuts. And so maybe Paul Ryan, who called Donald Trump a textbook racist, who prepared 2 speeches for election night on 2016, one of which would have denounced Trump as a nativist who was denying the facts, and the other of which, the one he delivered, celebrated him for showing the way for Republicans. Maybe we can just say, quoting a little bit differently King Henry, that tax cuts are worth a Charlottesville.
Thanks. It's in preparing for this, I watched the Aretha Franklin funeral to see, like, what does someone do at the end of a 9-hour session where you've got to follow all these amazing people, and that didn't help because Stevie Wonder was last, and so you can't sort of, it's good to be Stevie Wonder, I think. What I'm going to put my comments sort of in three categories. I want to start by talking about sort of lies, exaggerations, and postmodernism, and then quickly turn to the role that I think complexity plays in the post-truth economy. And then I want to go back to, I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk to something that Henry talked about and Jacob talked about a little bit in terms of, and Melissa did as well, in terms of how do we think about moving forward? What are there solutions that are sitting out there? Okay, so to start with this sort of exaggeration, lies, and complexity, I mean, one of the interesting things about a market economy is people exaggerate all the time. Like when you go buy a car, when you buy real estate, you know, they'll say like, look, this is oceanfront property. And then they, oh yeah, there's a road between you and the ocean, but it's still on the front. So the fact that Trump's a real estate magnate and he exaggerates a lot, I think, you know, when you look at, you know, people who are Trump supporters just don't see that as necessarily problematic. They just see something that's what business people do. But there's a distinction between exaggerations and outright lies. And one thing about American society that's interesting is we allow outright lies in business. Like those power bands that were for sale a few years ago, right? Like, I can't even push Henry over without the power band, but I put it on and I can like knock him over completely. In Australia, they outlawed those and they fined the people who were producing those millions of dollars. Because you're just, in some countries, you're not allowed to do those things. In Europe, you certainly can't, but in the United States, you can. And so when we think about the fact that democracy is taking place within a market economy, one thing we have to understand is part of our culture is, especially American culture, is allowing people to lie. What's interesting, though, is a book that came out just about a month ago by Michiko Kakutani called The Death of Truth, and she sort of blames this sort of post-truth economy slightly on postmodernism and the idea, you know, created within the academy that like, that there's many ways to tell a story, no single narrative has precedence over any other. And I think the thing is that what's interesting about the postmodernist movement is that at its core, I think it isn't necessarily, I think it's, as for the reasons that both Henry and Melissa were talking about, it's fabulous for democracy, but where it runs up being problematic is the notion that democracy, when we weigh these things in some sort of Habermasian way, right, and try and get it like what the right thing is, postmodernism also sort of denies that. And so Kakutani's point is that by denying that, we've moved to this sort of post-truth phase, and that's what allowed the sort of, the populace to sort of like make claims that in some sense aren't true. I want to focus, though, on, in the second part, though, on something else that I think has allowed that to happen as well. And this gets to something that Jacob was talking about, and that we now live in this incredibly complex world. Even though this is the age of information, it's this incredibly complex world, and the policy choices that people have to make, whether it's tax policy, climate policy, transportation policy, are these incredibly high-dimensional things. And so if you hang out, you know, just at the CIA last week, and you hear the acronym VUCA all the time for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? And it's a lot easier to be duped in those sort of settings. And I think one thing that it's worth sort of thinking about is these things, some of them are sort of exogenous. To a large extent, climate change, we have some levers that we can pull, but if we don't pull anything, it's just going to kind of roll out the way it rolls out. And on both sides of this, you know, people sort of exaggerate and wrong. So Paul Ehrlich on the first Earth Day in 1980 said that in 10 years, humans will be the only large mammals on the planet. Well, he was off by at least 30 years, right? And I think that you have sort of exaggerated statements on both sides, and the thing is, part of the reason why is no one can really understand this. But you also have endogenous complexity. I think one thing we forget about is if you spend time in Silicon Valley, in some sense, the whole nature of venture capital is lying, is basically saying, we're going to have in 5 years this technology that does this amazing thing. So Elizabeth Holmes, who now may go to jail for, you know, her Theranos business, in some sense, if she just would have got a little bit more money, or maybe the science would have worked just a little bit better, it would have worked and she would have been the young female Stephen Jobs. So at what point was Stephen Jobs lying? At what point is Elon Musk lying? And at what point are they sort of creating the world as they go? And in these complex spaces, I think that's hard to figure out. So what then I find puzzling, and when I was in the month thinking about this and reading things on and off, one of the things that's really puzzled me is that just as it's an age of complexity, it's also an age of incredible information. And so if I look at the other parts of the world, if I look at finance, if I look at retail, if I look at sports and arts, if I look at medicine, you're in this place. There's a wonderful book that just came out by Tom Malone. Actually, I can see his office from here through this window, which is kind of weird, called Superminds, right? And what Tom talks about in this book, he's a business professor at MIT, is that in all these spheres, we found ways to sort of link computational algorithmic power with human powers of inference to just make incredible breakthroughs, right? And so if you think about, you know, the efficiency with which Walmart and Amazon get us things, right? And you think about the sort of amazing ability that financial firms have to sort of like manipulate markets sometimes to the good and bad. You think about how sports teams, draft people, think about how they write movie scripts and market movies. And it's just amazing the ability to which people are using these information sources to give us better information, and yet, and better choices. And yet, in the political realm, it's not working. And one reason it may not be working, and I'm going to then here sort of leverage some ideas from Phil Tetlock, is that the coin of the realm in democracy, particularly the talking heads, is attention. It's not price, it's not profits. And so Tetlock shows that if you sort of break the world into, so suppose somebody's making a comment about if we privatize the prison system, costs will go up, they'll go down, or they'll stay the same. So what Tetlock did is he looked over like a 20-year period, I think it was like almost 10,000 predictions by talking heads, and he says, let's just break what happens into three categories: the lower third, the middle third, and the top third. So if it's in the lower third, it went down, the middle third, it stayed the same, top third, it went up. What he shows is that the far left and the far right, so whether it's Franken, right, or Conway, are worse than random. You'd literally be better off just spinning a dial and saying, oh, said down, right, and just taking the 1 out of 3 chance than listening to an extremist. And yet, we listen to extremists because it's entertaining, right? And there's all sorts of, if you sort of follow a lot of the, sort of more media-based post-truth literature, that's where a lot of the attention is spent. And so one of the things that's sort of intriguing then is because there's no, imagine if Jake were on TV, and suppose he was right 53% of the time, but I was just way more entertaining, and I'm only right 4% of the time. If I've got a giant 4% below me, and he's got a 53% below him, you're going to listen to him. Now, what's interesting about that, one of the best-selling books this past year was by Ray Diallo called The Principles, and he runs a company called Bridgewater, and I visited Bridgewater a while back, and at Bridgewater, that's exactly what they have. So every single person has a score, and they have a score relative to industry. So if we're talking about the pharmaceutical industry, and we panelists were sitting there, or if this were a meeting at Bridgewater, and we were talking about the pharmaceutical industry, you would all have on your phones 79, 82, 63, 4. And you'd be like, Scott's kind of funny, but he doesn't know, right? And so the thing is, and that allows, to the point you were making, it allows the democracy to work, and also pulling back to the sort of the postmodern thing, it allows sort of a weighing based on accuracy. And so one of the things I think that's worth then thinking about is how does one put in place ways for people to understand who are telling them things that are, generally true or been true in the past, or accurate in the past. And that leads to then a larger question in light of this complexity, and to pull back on both some of the things that Henry talked about and Jacob talked about is the early work of Lindblom, right? So Lindblom, and then I was taught this stuff by this guy named Art Stinchcombe, who was one of the first economic sociologists, would argue that there's kind of 3 ways to do things, right? You can have markets, hierarchies, and democracies. And one of the sort of funny things about how we train our students is when they go to economics class, they learn markets work. When they go to business school, they learn organizations work. In political science, they learn democracy works. But nobody ever tells them when to do each, right? There's a really interesting sort of meta problem. What should be done by democracy? What should be done by business? What should be done by democracies? But in the intervening 40 years, if you were to sort of rewrite Lindblom from scratch, I think you would add 2 things to that. I think you'd also add collectives. So I think things like Wikipedia, right? I think there's this sort of ability to sort of have sort of a non-structured collective that sort of decides things that wasn't possible in the past. And I think if you talk to people at Walmart and Amazon and BlackRock and the Chicago Cubs and MD Anderson, in the medical community, they would also, you can also just use algorithms. There are things that they've just ceded to algorithms. And Tom, along going back to the Supermind thing, would say, well, and also kind of algorithms people. So let's suppose we've got these things: markets, hierarchies, democracies, sort of collectives, and algorithms. It might be worth revisiting what we allow democracies to do, maybe expanding them in some ways and maybe reining them in other ways, because it may be in light of current technologies, in light of the complexity of current problems and opportunities, and given our understanding that in order to solve complex things, as Henry noted, what you need is diversity, you need variation, but you also need some sort of selection. You need some way of sort of adjudicating what works and what doesn't. Each of these organizational forms has the ability in some sense to do that, but it may be that we've sort of haven't done the matching problem in the right way, and maybe some of the post-truth issues, the things that really matter on things like tax policy, could go away if we moved things from one category to the other. Let me stop there.
Great. Well, I think that was an amazing conversation. And I would like to now just open it up to the audience. If people may be able to use the microphone here, this, I think, is a taped format, so then people can be part of the record forever. Then we can take a round of questions. We can open it up to the panel and get some comments.
Also, we can't see you at all. These bright lights.
Yes, in the back. If you could, but if you can speak very loudly, that's fine too. Great. Could we maybe collect a few more comments? Yes, here on the side. And could everybody make sure to also identify where you're from? Yes, I think it's a good idea to use the microphone as well.
Hi, Alex Sussis, Loyola Chicago Law School. I'm particularly curious with the problem of disinformation, hyper falsehood, overstatement, and its effect on democracy and politics, and the way to deal with it within the context of democratic free speech. In the United States, unless there's actual malice, it's almost impossible to shut down even falsehoods because of some of you have pointed out, the extent to which falsehood actually advances democracy sometimes. And yet, there's a real potential for this not only sparking something like Donald Trump, but much more authoritarian regimes. Have you all thought about that? I mean, does it require a change of a paradigm of free speech? Can we do it within the context of our free speech model? Is our speech model antiquated? Thank you.
Great. Let's take one last comment, and then we'll turn it over to the panel.
Steve Schifrin. I'm a emeritus law professor from Cornell. In the last 3 years in the law journals, if there are 2 big baskets of articles, and then a lot of smaller baskets, and one of those big baskets is fake news, false, the very subject of this panel. And I agree with Alex that there's, under the reigning paradigm of the First Amendment, it's very difficult to deal with it. But there will be a case that's narrower than the false facts, and that's climate change. The Attorney General of Massachusetts, the Attorney General of New York have opened investigations of ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil is claiming free speech. We're speaking out on a public issue. And I think there are very good arguments on the other side. The question I want to ask is, it strikes me as very clear that if the Democrats are going to prevail in the long run and gain control of the Senate, they are going to have to appeal, as Bill Connolly said 20 years ago, to white males. And it seems to me rural white males. And I'm wondering if what was described in What's the Matter with Kansas is different today than it was when that book was written.
Great, thank you. I think maybe if we can go down the line, people, I think there are microphones under your chairs. If you could use those, and then we should have enough time to go back to the audience. If you can keep your comments brief, panelists.
Okay, quickly. Sorry, other way. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please, Henry.
Okay, quickly on free speech. I think one of the, free speech is a huge problem. It's also, there's a particular problem with social media, and I'm not going to say which is the way we should go, just point out the problems, which is that under Section 320 of the Communications Decency Act, it's possible for social media companies, on the one hand, cannot be held responsible for the content that they spread. On the other hand, they are encouraged to set up, they have safe harbor to regulate independently without reference to any set government standards what it is that people can or cannot say. If you want to be optimistic about it, that suggests that there is a place for these businesses to, as a purely commercial decision, get rid of some of the fake news problem. If you want to be a pessimist, and I definitely want to be a pessimist on this, you look at the ways in which this is going to also subject them to extraordinary political pressures, as we've seen in the last couple of days with Donald Trump and Kevin McCarthy threatening investigations against Google for being quote-unquote unfair to conservative voices and perspectives.
So I want to respond to the question that Linda McLean asked me, which is about the problem of bigotry. So on the one hand, I've argued that the problem of the duped and the damned is that, in a way, it encourages us to see our fellow citizens as irretrievably damned, as just beyond the pale in terms of their racism, their sexism, their xenophobia. So what's the remedy? Is it not to call out bigotry when we see it? And so my impulse is to say this, that the problem with Hillary Clinton's statement of the basket of deplorables is a couple of things. One is the language of the basket, which in a way is dehumanizing. The other is to think about people as being essentially deplorable, essentially bigots, essentially racists, as opposed to people who hold racist views. And so the claim is not that we shouldn't challenge people's judgments, especially when they're, morally wrong, when they're racist or anything. That should be called out. But it should be done so in a way that is respectful to their basic capacity for agency. And so our language really does matter in that regard. It's not merely a strategic problem. But I think there is a way in which it's superior morally to speak to people as if they are forming deliberative judgments.
I guess I'll quickly speak to the, poor rural white voters, and that's my background. And I think that one of the things that was difficult for me after the Trump win was that my colleagues, who typically aren't, were really derogatory towards my people, the people I grew up with. And it was interesting when I tried to do some sort of normative accounting of who are the better people. I kind of found that my people at home kind of seemed better people to me. And it's just that they know in the sense that, not that my colleagues commit crimes, but these people follow the law, they don't commit crimes, they donate tons of money to their charity, they do lots of volunteer work, they spend their vacations down in Haiti and other places volunteering, they adopt handicapped children from Africa. I mean, these are good people. They just have strong views on abortion, and they have strong views on, sort of the government being out of their lives. And I think that, so for the Democratic Party, or for any party, to attract those voters, I think that they have to, in some sense, I think, speak to them and praise them for the good parts of how they live, as opposed to just, sort of deploring some of the parts of, their political opinions and behaviors that maybe aren't as, what we would all want.
Well, first of all, I love the idea that each profession has something it believes in, right? I don't know I'm a political scientist, but I often think about, well, what does sociology think? And I would say that it might think that nothing works, but that would be too cynical. But I wonder if political science is moving towards that view as well. That seems to be the kind of Aiken and Bartel's take. So, to me, I've been thinking about this in the context of the idea of norm protection. or policing. You know, if you read the Ziblatt and Levitsky book, which I think is strong, they put a heavy emphasis on the idea that the norms are kind of the soft guardrails of democracy. And in this context, I think that would imply that there's some kinds of gatekeepers, guardians, who are sort of an establishment that is policing the truth. And if there's any message that should come across in what I've just said, is that the establishment, you know, is kind of left the field in that regard. It's not as if they're being overwhelmed. They are, but it's partly because there are a lot fewer people in that world who are doing the norm policing. And I guess I'm skeptical that we can resurrect that. I think there's just a lot of special conditions that allowed there to be, and some of them were not that salutary, norms that were quite repressive, that allowed that to be a kind of integral part of American democracy, where folks just didn't say things like this or didn't do things like this, even though they did some things that we would consider beyond the pale today. And therefore, I've been thinking a lot about, and maybe this is a Lindblomian solution, I don't know, but about the rebalancing of power relations, right? How much difference does that make? And I think it would make a significant difference. Let's just start with the most obvious thing, right? What is enabling the post-truth presidency of the moment? It's the fact that there's no discipline coming from Congress, and that's because the Republican Party has decided that it is Trump's party, either because it's afraid of its own voters or because it figures, rightly I think, that if Trump goes down, it goes down too, and this is kind of like the smash and grab moment of American politics, get what you can while you can. But I think, you know, the discipline of elections is going to be a fundamental power balancing, rebalancing thing, or could be. The other is organizations, and I think this on the long term is just much more important. I'll say no more than that. I think a huge amount of why you can see voters express very different views and prioritize very different things with the same underlying interests and values has to do with the kinds of organizations that bring them into politics and socialize them into it. And so there, I just think the decline of unions is just a fundamental issue, and that rebuilding the kinds of organizations that reach ordinary Americans is a fundamental imperative.
Great. Yes, here on the third row back. Yes, yeah. You come to the microphone.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Stroshine, University College London. I do work on democracies that are divided ethnically and religiously, and they have adopted a rather thin understanding of what democracy can do, because they've already been existing in this kind of post-truth situation where they don't believe anything the other group believes about history, et cetera, Bosnia, Romania, et cetera. But they can still work together because the alternative is violence. And I'm just wondering if, as Americans, we've sort of taken for granted this idea that we can all really engage in democracy and really debate. A lot of places in the world just have to accept to live with difference and have a kind of thin understanding that we work together just because that equilibrium is better, because we don't want our kids to grow up in a war zone. So I'm just wondering if you might have a response to that idea. Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Bruce Parrott. I'm from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you for a wonderful panel. I think this was extremely stimulating and enlightening. I have a couple of comments. One is, we have been talking in a way around the issues of knowledge, excuse me, knowledge and ignorance. But I think we ought to ask ourselves more rigorously what we mean by knowledge and ignorance. This was touched on by one of the speakers who referred to postmodernism and its possible political consequences. But for the last 2 decades, there have been historians of science who have been pursuing what they call agnotology, the study of ignorance. And there's now an international handbook of ignorance studies. And when I first encountered this title, I thought it was absurd. And now I think it's profound, because the point of the contributors is that ignorance is not passive. And we are inheritors of a kind of Enlightenment notion that knowledge grows and ignorance declines. And their point is that ignorance can grow easily, and that it is promoted by organized interests, not just by sloppy minds. And here the issue comes in of the interaction between commercial and economic interests and ideas. Naomi Oreskes from Harvard a few years ago published a book called Merchants of Doubt, which showed the efforts of certain organized economic interests to set up think tanks which would produce doubt about scientific conclusions. So this is a case of organized ignorance in action, if you will. And then my question, what are the implications of what you've said for our intellectual institutions, for not just our think tanks, not just our media, but for our universities and schools? Are we doing the job we should be doing to help strengthen democracy? Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Regina Bateson from MIT, and I have a question primarily for Melissa. I'm wondering if you've considered whether your framework of the duped and the damned could explain intra-party conflict as well. Is the partisan gulf that you describe necessary for that framework, or can it apply to some of the conflict between different elements of the Democratic Party and their activists and elements internal to the Republican Party as well? And if so, what does that say about the future possibilities for grassroots organizing in the country, whether on the right or on the left? And is this trend a result of elite interventions, sort of pushing these kinds of frameworks to sow divisions among grassroots activists, or is it a trend that we see because of the platforms that people are using to communicate with each other? I'd love your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great. Could we maybe have two more comments? So if you could give your comment, and if one more person wanted to come. Sure, please, thanks.
Louise Comfort, University of Pittsburgh. And I have a question about complexity. And the real issue is the success of the post-truth world seems to me to correlate with the complexity of the economic, political, social environment we find ourselves in. Is the ability to reframe the issues in ways that people can understand a fundamental responsibility for returning our democracy to functional acknowledgement of evidence-based decision-making?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ella from Swarthmore College. My comment and question is directed for Jacob. I'm curious about the incentives of the Republican elite, and I get what their short-term incentives are for producing some of these misinformation and lies, but I really wonder what they view as their long-term strategy. This misinformation seems to promote chaos and disorder. Do they want that? What are they aiming for in the long term?
Great. Thank you very much. Maybe can we reverse the order? Is that okay? We'll start with Jacob.
Yes, and since I spoke for a while last time, I'll keep this really brief and say, first of all, the great quote for Merchants of Doubt is a great book. The great quote is that famous Upton Sinclair quote that it's hard to get a man to believe something if his income depends on not believing it. And so I do think that we should really be looking at the way in which these rent-seeking interests have confused and deceived. But I also think there is a huge obligation on the part of academics, and I'll just put in a plug for an organization I'm part of, the Scholar Strategy Network, which is a decentralized, federated organization that consists of networks of scholars across the country who are trying to explain what they're doing in simple, not too complex ways, and contribute to civic dialogue. Ella, your question's excellent. And I think it's obviously varied a lot. One thing I want to be careful about is, with some exceptions, Paul Ryan I think is an exception, this isn't a conscious strategy on the part of most of those who are involved in it, right? It's much more like an emergent property of the party having these two imperatives, right? Or a perceived imperative to shovel money to the rich, and a true electoral imperative to stay in office, or it won't be able to do the things it wants to do. I do think that we're seeing this, as I said, Trump is a product of is sort of like the worst thing to come out of the Pandora's box in some ways. The Republican elites, the establishment, are losing control, right? And more they're tied to Trump in fear rather than hope. And so the long-term strategy at this point seems to be to hope. And I'll hand it off to Scott, but we can talk more about it afterwards.
Yeah, I'll be really brief on the education part of this. I was down at Duke Medical Center yesterday. I was talking about being at this panel, and they were joking. They said, it's just so easy for us because if their child gets sick, or your parent gets sick, or your spouse gets sick, you immediately go to the experts. Like, there's no question you go to a doctor. You don't go see what somebody's blogging about or something, right? And for some reason, we haven't done a good enough job sort of convincing people that we actually are good scientists. I mean, Louise has a fabulous book on earthquakes and catastrophic risk that's coming out, and I think if people would look at that, they would go to her rather than sort of listen to some talking head on TV. But maybe, it's partly on us that we have not established the credibility. Like, economists don't have the credibility of doctors, right? Even though they may be as accurate.
Thanks. So a little bit on political conflict and whether or not there's an incentive on the part of grassroots or anybody who's in a position of political leadership to seek to exacerbate the problem of the duped and the damned, and to see people on the opposing side of the aisle or one's co-partisans even as essentially duped or damned. I think that might be right, and if that's the case, if there's increasingly little prospect of compromise or finding a middle ground, I think that only underscores the need for more majoritarian institutions, which are essentially more egalitarian in certain respects, in a very thin respect of treating people equally, not necessarily substantively equal. But the problem is that too thin? And so the hope is perhaps that you can thicken up this account of equality of saying, well, look, if we fundamentally disagree about these matters politically, if we can't act, if we know that we're riven by disagreement, is our best bet just to see each other as being, in a way, able political agents? And so how to square that circle, how to say, well, look, I fundamentally disagree with you and I have an incentive to try to demonize you, while simultaneously regarding people as, co-participants in a democratic process. That's really, really a deep challenge, and I don't have an easy remedy for it.
I just would like to, reinforce a little bit of what Jacob said in response to the questions about complexity. I think that the importance of groups and the desiccation of the landscape of groups that can serve as intermediaries and informational intermediaries in U.S. politics is one of our major problems. That effectively we do live in an incredibly complex world. It is impossible for people for individuals to understand it all. I think this also means, this is one of the reasons why I think that the Aiken and Bartel's analysis is overstated, that we need to start thinking much more systematically about what kinds of groups, what kinds of group procedures, group decision-making processes, group problem-solving processes are best for providing useful and valuable information and allowing citizens to outsource a lot of the informational tasks that they simply, nobody has time to do this. Nobody has the ability to do this, and we do not have the appropriate places to outsource this to. And I also think that there is an important role for the Academy in this. And I can say this is one of the things that Anna and I have tried to do a little bit as program chairs for this meeting, is really to do as much as we can to bring political science into better contact with the broader conversations that are happening in society. I have to say it's been heartening to see how many people are getting involved and engaged in a way which I think many political scientists would have thought to be unthinkable a few years ago, but there's a ton more that needs to be done. And here in particular, I'd like to give a shout out to Regina Bateson, who has asked a question and who's been doing this in maybe the most practical manner possible. So we need more people to do this. Thank you. She's running for Congress. So.
Well, and can I just say, on Henry, thank you for the program has been excellent for that. And we should all, you've done a really excellent job. Thanks.
Yes, let's give Henry a round of applause. Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. The person in the back, if you would come forward. And if there's one more person, this person, you've had your hand up for a while. Yeah, if you'd come out to the...
I am Albert Salosa from Phoenix College. And I'm just wondering about these 2 things in my mind. We have tremendous amount of information. In fact, we have so much that we cannot possibly grapple everything about everything, or even with the smallest topics. Why is this era called post-truth? Have we acceded to the fact that no one is able to say the truth in spite of tremendous amount of information? I wonder if there is an alternative to the notion of post-truth. Thank you.
Please. Could you just, introduce her?
Really excited about this panel. I kind of just finished my dissertation on kind of this topic, so it's been great to hear this. One of the questions that I have for most of the panelists, and I think Dr. Page, maybe in the last thing you said, was talking about if we had 2 people with a number underneath the person and what you would think about that. And all that I can think is it depends on what party the person is. Like it depends the valence of how you take that, because I think we're doing a very political science thing right now where we think the answer to post-truth is more truth. And I don't think like the lack of truth is what destroyed the truth. I think emotion and feeling has a large part of it, and I think back to Senator Joe Wilson yelling in the Congress at Obama, yelling, "You lie." Well, Obama wasn't lying, right? But he felt like that, and a lot of people felt like that. And we can document how many times Trump lies, but a lot of people still feel that he's speaking the truth. So I'm just wondering how much, truth is related to truth, or if it's related to your feeling about who and what is speaking. I mean, part of Messengers of Doubt was to put the New York Times, or major magazines on the same plane as think tanks that were saying, oh, climate change isn't real, right? So it's kind of, if we shoot the messenger, which unfortunately I think might be happening with the academy right now. I mean, I think we all know the active efforts that are taken to discredit academia, and just what happens when it all becomes opinion, and your opinion is motivated by your feelings. Like, do we need to talk about feelings to talk about truth in this post-truth age?
Great question. I think maybe what I would ask is that if the panelists, if you want to address those questions, but also if you just want to have a final word from your thoughts and wrapping up. And maybe we'll start with Melissa.
I think there is something to the worry of truth as the metric for a political contribution. So in the sense that if we think that people who are in a way, who we think are skeptical about climate change or something like that, are incapable of actually making good judgments, does this push us down the path to something like epistocracy? And I think that democracy can be justified on a variety of grounds that are not, that have nothing to do with the truth aptness of the questions that we're asking. And so I think that that may be a more fruitful way, which is not to say that democracy doesn't require some actual information to be able to function. But I think it's to the extent that we think of citizens as being repositories of knowledge, and more knowledgeable, less knowledgeable, there's a way in which we're going to become skeptical about the promise of democracy more generally. And perhaps that might be justified, but I think most of us here would be worried about such a claim.
Yeah, no, I don't in any way advocate, point systems. I don't know. I'm just saying that it's interesting, like in some firms, that's exactly how they do it. But it would be nice on, talking heads on television have just some understanding of it. Has this person even been close to right in the past, right? Would be, I think, useful for people. I think, though, some of this comes down to, this idea of norms as soft guardrails is so interesting, because like when Gerald Ford noticed things were just too complicated, he couldn't understand it when he became president. I mean, Ford, like any person, had flaws and great strengths, and one of his strengths was knowing what he knew and what he didn't know. So he put together the first presidential science policy advisory group, right? And they said to him, well, you want all Republicans, right? And he says, well, what does being a Republican or Democrat have to do with science? It's just Imagine someone saying that now. I mean, it's just, so it's really incredible how one of the things that I think, you talked about emotion, but in addition to emotion, the fact that we've let partisanship sort of enter into truth, which has, some postmodern spin to it in some sense, but I think that's also a problem. I mean, so I think that I'd like to see us collectively, and this gets to Henry's point, if it's a discipline of political science could teach people one thing, is what you really want is smart people with diverse backgrounds, right, diverse training, diverse models, diverse understandings, working together to solve problems like obesity, inequality, climate change, right? That's how we're going to move the needle, not by people with simplistic left-right positions yelling at one another.
Do you want maybe Jacob, and then I'll leave it to Henry to close out.
Well, I actually don't really think I have much to add. I've said a lot already, so I'll hand it off to Henry.
Great.
Okay, three somewhat dissimilar points. One on the question of sort of ranking people on their ability to understand the truth. I think one of the things we've got to be careful about here is that politics always enters into this. And I can never remember whether it's Bridgewater or Bridgestone. One of them is the conspiracy from the Byrne movies, and the other one is so if you have the guy there who is the head guy is also the one who is rated as being the most awesomely intelligent on every topic possible. And now it could be that he is indeed the person who succeeded by virtue of his individual skills, or it could be that we're primates who signal sort of deference in various ways by rating the awesomeness of the boss as being the awesomest ever. And so we're always going to have politics, and we're always going to have so this kind of I think of it as a Stiglitz kind of phenomenon, whereby sort of information channels carry multiple different signals, which invariably means that they are going to be somewhat less reliable. And this is going to apply just as much for any of these schemes of discovering the truth as for anything else. On the question of, I think that the post-truth question, one of the reasons why post-truth is such a big deal is that there are a lot of people who are in shock. They thought that they were living in one America. At the beginning of November 2016, they discovered that they were living in a very different America, and that's not entirely a bad thing. And here this, I think, speaks to some of what Scott was talking about the fact that there are a lot of people who have genuinely, who have real values, and who were feeling, I think correctly, that they were being written out of the narrative. So maybe rather than thinking about truth, we need to think about how it is that there are these different perspectives. Some of these perspectives get filtered out, some do not. We have some primitive work on how the perspectives of rich people seem to get quite a lot of deference, but we do not have anything approaching a mapping of the informational processes that really make things happen. Final thing I'd like to make an appeal for is for policy juries and similar ways as one way of providing deference to ordinary citizens and introducing a bunch of people into the equation in a way that can plausibly work. And here, I'm Irish originally. One of the important and most unexpected things in Ireland over the last few years has been the way in which we have seen, for example, legislation for marriage equality being introduced by a whopping constitutional majority. This is as a result of a policy jury, effectively. There was a citizens' convention of randomly selected people who were brought together. They were presented by a variety of different competing perspectives by policy experts, and then they decided that we needed to have marriage equality. Many of them were convinced from their original positions, and this not only provided, I think, a better solution to the problem than otherwise would have occurred, but it also provided Irish voters with the sense that this was not something which was being foisted upon them by elites, but that a whole bunch of their own people had thought about, had deliberated upon, and had figured out was the best solution, which I think sort of had some very, very important political agenda-setting consequences.
Wonderful. I think that's a perfect uplifting note to end on, that maybe we have some solutions in our basket. I want to thank the panel one more time, and thanks everyone for joining in the conversation.